Canberra, director of the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal here at the Hudson Institute. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's discussion of a terrific speech delivered almost a year ago at MIT by Atlantic Philanthropies President Gara LaMarche, entitled Reclaiming the Moral Life of Philanthropy. As usual, a special welcome to our viewers on live stream or Ustream or whatever that's the formal name of that is. In that speech, Gara expressed, as he put it, and I quote, a disquiet about the way we in the foundation world, along with the organizations we support and the infrastructure many of us have helped to build, have mirrored trends in the political world to talk about what we do and why we are doing it in ways that have strayed too far from first principles. He continues, we have become more about the fix, the intervention, to use a horribly dominant word in the field that calls to mind invading armies, than about the reasons for doing or caring about it. In marching under the flag of what works, and in particular what can be proven or demonstrated through the rigors of evidence, we risk straying too far from what is right. I think it's time to strike a better balance, he concludes. The Bradley Center thought that this was a terrific stimulant for a conversation, one of our monthly panels here at the Bradley Center. And for those of you, I suspect some of you are here for the first time. I should add, we do try to do these panels once a month, and we do try to have this kind of reasonably mixed and balanced group of commentators on the issues. So if you're interested in these kinds of conversations, please be sure we have your email address. Anyway, we thought that this would be a terrific topic for one of our, what we like to think, are stimulating and provocative conversations. So it's with great pleasure that we introduce to you today a distinguished group of individuals to pursue that conversation. We'll hear first from Gara LaMarche himself. I should note, in the interest of full disclosure, that the Bradley Center here at Hudson is a proud grantee not only of the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee, but also of Atlantic Philanthropies. Gara will be followed by Maya Wiley, Director of the Center for Social Inclusion, then Phil Buchanan, President of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and finally, returning for one of his frequent visits to the Bradley Center, Les Lenkowski, a professor at Indiana University and a former president of Hudson Institute. So, Gara, why don't you kick us off, if you could, please?
Thank you very much, Bill. I am glad to be given the opportunity to come and talk here at the Bradley Center. I've been this is my third or fourth panel over the years, and one of the reasons that when Bill asked if we would support the series a year or two ago, I was delighted to be able to do it, is because I think that the Bradley Center is one of the very few places in philanthropy, on the right or the left, where there is a genuine debate and discussion that is ideologically diverse, and where people actually kick around in serious ways important societal questions and questions about philanthropy. So that's rare enough that it seems to me that it deserves support when it happens. So I'm grateful both for the existence of the Bradley Center and the work of Bill and Kristen and others, and also for the opportunity to come and talk here today. It's a great compliment to me, or that's not quite the way I want to say it, but I consider it a wonderful thing that somebody pays enough attention to something that you write and say that they offer an opportunity for you to hear critiques and reactions to it. That's also something that's a little too rare in the philanthropic world and the nonprofit world. So, I have over my 15 years or so in philanthropy, and particularly in the last 4 or 5 years at Atlantic Philanthropies, of which I am now the former president and CEO as of July 1st. I have thought a lot about philanthropic questions and talk about them from time to time, and MIT gave me an interesting opportunity to do that. And it's been a kind of a little afterlife of the speech, and I'm really grateful for the kind of panel that's been put together today. And indeed, looking out at the audience, I know enough about so many of the people here to know that it'll be great to have engagement, whether it's critical, supportive, or what. By the way, on the audience note, I should say, as an active person in the Facebook community, that I know, thanks to that today's the birthday of Aaron Dorfman, the executive director of the National of NCRP. Well, we were having a discussion about how old you were, and you can confirm later because you're probably concerned about identity theft, so you didn't put your age on Facebook. But we'll see who came closer in our little bet. But anyway, I am a proud board member of NCRP, and it's great to have Aaron here today. Bill puckishly thought it would be fun to ask my permission to use the picture of Charlton Heston from the Ten Commandments promoting the panel, and this righteous fellow holding the tablets in the air it was probably one of the reasons so many of you turned out today, and. It reminds me of Mort Halpern, my friend, who is now at the Open Society Institute, but who had been at ACLU and other places I've worked over the years. He's had a joke about Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, and the crowd was waiting to hear, and somebody said, "What happened?" And he said, he tells this anecdote about legislative negotiation. Somebody came back, Moses comes back from negotiating with God, and says to the Israelites, whatever, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I got him down to 10. The bad news is adultery's still in. So there's a little Ten Commandment joke to get us started here today. But what's funny about the Ten Commandment metaphor is I guess it has some relationship to the question of morality, obviously, but I think if the Ten Commandments had been written by a lot of foundations today, it might not actually have been succinctly put as, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not bear false witness. There would have been a logic model probably, to explain what the theory of change was, for when you shouldn't bear false witness or covet thy neighbor's wife. So let me say, I gave this talk, and some of you have read it, but I'm assuming not everyone has. So I'm going to do just a very short kind of riff on it, and then I'm really eager to hear what people have to say who I know have read it or heard it, and I'm very eager to hear what the conversation is that's more participatory. I have had a feeling for a while that in the movement in philanthropy and the nonprofit world generally toward a greater degree of pragmatism and a focus on effectiveness, and along with that, very often metrics, which is not a trend that I entirely decry by any means. I've worked both at the Open Society Institute, where George Soros didn't really put much truck in evaluation or metrics and was kind of intuitive philanthropist. I've known over the years Jim Pearson, who was the president of the Owen Foundation, another spend-down foundation like Atlantic Philanthropies, and having interviewed him both for my class and in various public settings, I know that when you ask the question about Owen, of how did they think about evaluation and so on, they don't really have as much to say as, let's say, the Hewlett Foundation would. And yet, the Owen Foundation, in my view, in its relatively brief life, was a tremendously effective foundation. I don't agree with many of the things that the Owen Foundation supported. I'm on a different point in the ideological spectrum, but I think it's undeniable that they had a significant impact on public policy and on the way people think about things, even while not having all the language of metrics and all the apparatus of that. So Atlantic Philanthropies, when I came there, I think was squarely in the community of foundations that arose in the last 10 or 15 years in what I would call a kind of an effectiveness movement. I mean, Phil, from CEP, who's here today, is a key figure in that. Edna McConnell Clark, Hewlett, number of foundations, institutions, GEO, which I think Kathleen is here today. And I think that's a very important movement in philanthropy. My own roots are more in what you might call the social justice movement in philanthropy, and I believe that the right place to be is in some marriage of those two. So it's not a point that I'm not making a point that we need to abandon all concern with measurability and impact and effectiveness. And I think there's much good about those movements. But the disquiet I've had that I talk about at some length in the speech with the way much of philanthropy is developed is because is that it has become largely unhinged from the basic values which ought to animate philanthropy, and that effectiveness for its own sake has no point. And that there has to be an underlying core. I'm not arguing that there's a right morality or a wrong. That's a critique that we can get into, because obviously my sense of what a moral position is might be different than your sense of a moral position. I believe, though, that people are most effective when they argue from first principles, and they must never stray too far from that, which is what I was talking about a little bit in the quote that Bill read. So in the talk I gave, I walked through from my own life and from the work of other philanthropies a number of examples of issues that I've dealt with where I felt the failure to be sufficiently grounded in larger values and moral principles was costly over time. And the initial example I used, which is very timely today, I think, was in my time in Texas at the Texas Civil Liberties Union, which was a fun time. No, it was. It was one of the best jobs I ever had, running the ACLU in Texas. There was a lot of work to be done, and Texas is a very diverse state in a lot of ways, and I had a great time doing it. And one of the challenges that we felt there was that the state was locking up too many people for nonviolent offenses, and that there ought to be alternatives to incarceration. This is a movement that's really grown over the years, and that OSI, when I was there, and still to this day, is a key funder of. And we began to use cost-benefit language in talking about prisons and incarceration. And that language became at some point very appealing to the then Republican governor of the state, Bill Clements, and some of the leaders in the Republican side in the Texas Senate and the Texas House of Representatives, who were looking for ways in the fiscal crisis of whatever year it was, 1986, 1987, to save money, and found it appealing to try to reduce the prison population in order to save money. And indeed they did. And so the Texas Department of Corrections population went down some bit when I was there. However, in the years since, it's, I think, quadrupled. And a lot of reasons for that all over the country. And indeed, we're beginning to see a bit of a contrary trend, because we are, again today, and I think actually in Indiana this has been going on too, almost all of the states. You know, the fiscal crisis has caused even very conservative people with good law and order credentials to rethink the question of over-reliance on incarceration. But the point that I was trying to make was that if you believe, as we did, that it is wrong in a free society to that incarceration should be a penalty of last resort. I mean, if you don't believe in the death penalty, which I also don't, it should be a penalty of last resort, and obviously needs to be used for many serious offenders. But it ought to be used relatively sparingly. We lock up more people for more periods of time, than any other place, certainly in the democratic world. And we had a set of values that we believed in about that, about when it is right to use incarceration, when it is wrong to use incarceration, why there's an important liberty value at stake, and so on and so forth. And yet I think we strayed pretty far from it when we decided to argue it principally in cost-benefit terms. And the problem with that is that while there may be a short-term effectiveness on that, and recently in the New York Times, Michelle Alexander, who's the author of The New Jim Crow, is that the name of the book, who used to be a Soros Justice Fellow, argued this, I thought, very, very eloquently. And if you look at my blog, I kind of quote this at some length, and I won't do so here today because it would require me to put on my glasses, which I'm trying to avoid doing. So, because my regular glasses broke, and I have these glasses that kind of look like I'm a German architect, and I don't know, we're being live streamed, and what can I say? So, in any event, the failure to build a movement pertaining to over-reliance and incarceration that is grounded in first principles, and it only takes advantage of short-term opportunities that are posed by the desire to save money, over time means that you don't really build any kind of a movement or public understanding of why it is that we need to be sparing about incarceration in the first place. And I think it's short-sighted to argue those issues only in economic terms. By the same token, if you look at the field of civil liberties, and Atlantic and OSI have both been extremely active in the last almost 10 years in funding organizations that are fighting what we believe to be some of the civil liberties abuses of the post 9/11 era, Guantanamo, torture, those kinds of things, military commissions. It's happened that a lot of advocates have, of necessity, and I think very smartly in some ways, made arguments about why torture is wrong that rely very heavily on what I might call effectiveness arguments. In other words, I happen to believe, and there may be, I'm sure there is a diversity of opinions in this room, that torture is flat out wrong. It should not be available. I believe the international conventions hold that, but I also believe fundamentally it's the right thing to do to oppose torture, and I don't think it should be available in any humane and democratic society. In fighting the reemergence of torture in the last 10 years or so, particularly under the Bush administration, I think advocates were very smart in many ways in bringing military personnel into the discussion, people who could argue that torture was ineffective, that it never produced good results, all those kinds of things. And I think that is an important arrow to have in the quiver if you're concerned about stopping torture. But if it's the only arrow or the principal arrow in your quiver, you leave yourself very open. You can live or die by the effectiveness argument. And I happen to believe it's both true that torture is wrong and that it's ineffective. But if for some reason it was proven to be effective, I'd still be against it. And I think the more you get away from that fundamental moral argument, the worse off you are. And there's some evidence in public opinion, as I say in the speech, that what appeals most to people in having a discussion about the values that underlie this is a return to basic discussion of values. That if you ask people in public opinion polling what the strongest argument against torture it is, it doesn't turn out to be that it doesn't work. It turns out to be that that's not who we are as a country. And that turns out to be the most resonant thing with people. I also talk in the speech about immigration, school reform, the kind of budget struggles that are going on right now, and the failure, healthcare, which Atlantic was deeply involved in. I think that there are probably people in this room who think the healthcare law is an abomination. There are people like me who thought it was a significant, although not quite adequate, social reform and expansion of the social safety net. We have a diversity of views on those things, and I give the president a great deal of credit for identifying the issue and running with it at some cost to his own political capital. I do think, however, and this is strange in an administration which is headed by a man who obviously has enormous rhetorical gifts and is capable of arguing things in terms of first principles, that the healthcare debate was waged largely on kind of technocratic grounds, it seemed to me. And I think that the, if you will, the progressive side of that argument suffered greatly from it. I think the conservative side of the budget debate, the healthcare debate, and a lot of current debates, has the advantage, though I disagree with virtually all of the actual positions taken, the advantage very often of being grounded in more fundamental moral rhetoric. The Tea Party, I have a lot of issues with the Tea Party, but I have little doubt that many of the people in it are motivated by a strong moral sense that overspending is wrong and that we ought to live within our means and so on. And very often they articulate it that way. You don't find that quite as often on the progressive side. Finally, I guess I want to say that I think I think I was in a panel here a year or two ago that was about the Obama administration and foundations, too close for comfort, I think that Bill titled it. And we talked a bit about the relationship between Obama administration and foundations. And one of the things that comes up in that all the time is the Social Innovation Fund and the race to the top and all the things that are going on in the current administration that are meant to be grounded in evidence-based policies and programs that work and actually flow quite strongly from the trends I've been talking about and the work that's been done by foundations like Hewlett and Robin Hood and Edna McConnell Clark. And as I say, there's a lot to be said for that movement. So the Obama administration, in a smallish way, in the Social Innovation Fund, in a larger way, through Race to the Top and other things, has really tried to taken that and tried to put it to work in the way government programs are funded. And we'll see how that all comes out. It's not that long ago that the first rounds of grants in the Social Innovation Fund have been made. People in and around the Social Innovation Fund and the effectiveness movement of philanthropy have been talking to me recently about the concern that we lack any real constituency for effective programs. That there is, in order to protect and advance this movement in government and in philanthropy, we need to build a stronger base for it. And I agree with that. And I don't think that you will build that constituency until you do that, until you reach out more, not simply to the elites that are concerned with social policy, we're talking about education reform a bit over lunch, but until there is an investment in that by the people most affected in the communities that philanthropy, or government for that matter, is trying to help, until people are more actors than acted upon. And I think the flaw in the, or the challenge for things like the Social Innovation Fund is that there is no natural constituency for effectiveness as such, that nobody wants to march under the banner of effectiveness or proven programs, important though that may be. People care about education reform, or they should, or they care about the elimination of poverty, or they should, because they don't like to see people go hungry, and they don't like children to go to schools which aren't serving them very well. That is why people get up in the morning and work in the various kinds of nonprofits, some of which are represented here. They're not fundamentally driven by a sense of pragmatism or effectiveness or even impact. And when I'm arguing, much less eloquently, I can assure you, than I try to do with the speech. I don't like to repeat myself. So, so you get what you don't pay for. But but what I'm arguing essentially is that you really you don't need to abandon the approach that a number of people in this room represent about metrics and effectiveness, but we need to ground all the work we do, whether on the right or the left, but my critique is mainly aimed at my colleagues on the progressive side, unless we know what we're about in the sense of our fundamental values and articulate our programs and our policies in terms of those values. And it is to, well, and here's I'll close with a kind of interesting question, is to that, or dilemma or conundrum, is to that we should return. But then the question is it a return? You know, is it reclaiming the moral life of philanthropy, or is it inventing it in the first place? I wonder. Anyway, that's all I have to say to get it started. So thanks for your time.
So I feel a little challenged to follow Gara on a question about philanthropy and morals, when he reminded me in the green room that he first met me when he was in the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union Board, and I was a very junior staff attorney that stormed the meeting with a whole bunch of other junior staff attorneys to demand higher wages. And then the metric, I then realized, if we're going to talk about metrics that apply to that with my value of, living wage, which I was not earning, was that I had that job for a year and I never got a pay raise. So not so transformational, my little experience with you to begin with. But I will say that I will say that Gara then hired me later at the Open Society Institute. Thank you. I appreciate that. So he didn't say that when I worked there, by the way. So I stand here in the position I hold here is a little bit different, because I spend my days actually as a grant seeker. While I have spent some time on the side of staffing of philanthropy, not very long, not a big part of my career, and only at the Open Society Institute, which, as Gara has said, not a place where George Soros spent a lot of time talking about evaluation metrics, whether we were going to use a log frame model or some other model of evaluation of our work, and where there certainly were principles, values at work in terms of what the foundation was supposed to do, what it was supposed to produce, certainly in some important ways, even if we didn't always know all of it. Because open society, and a democratic open society in which everyone can participate, was a core value of the foundation. So in reflecting on what Gara said at MIT, I mean, the short answer, and particularly as a grant seeker, I agree. And I don't have a lot actually to challenge in terms of the speech itself. I think that there are some fundamental parts of the larger conversation it actually calls us to that I wanted to highlight, which is, if we think about some of the tension underlying this issue of, whether the role of philanthropy is to be accountable in a narrow sense to a particular sets of metrics and outcomes, and then what are those, and then creates a log frame model to identify that without a discussion of what we are actually trying to produce in the country, what we are trying to produce more wholly, more holistically, and more largely beyond what the foundation itself does, right? If we assume that's much of what's talked, that's the tension point. Are we producing a longer term, larger impact, or are we trying to make sure that the actual specific dollars that are put out there do what the program officer said to his or her higher ups it would do, right? That in a sense, one, it's a false dichotomy, because certainly the foundation at a certain level has to be accountable for the spending of its money. But two, that it actually ignores the really the larger question that not just philanthropy, but also those of us on the grant-seeking side are confronting, which is, are we talking about transformation or are we talking about transaction? And when can transaction be transformational? So I'm going to give a couple of examples that build a little bit off of some of the points that Gara raised, and I'm going to use healthcare, not both because it was one of the examples in Gara's speech, but also because it's a body of work that we've been working on. And so if you think about, and I completely agree that the kind of conversation and at least the tactics around healthcare reform, not necessarily the desires, but the tactics became very, very transactional, right? We'll appeal to a cost containment frame so that the goal is cost containment. And the interesting thing is actually when you think about fundamentally why people care about it in the first place, whether or not you agree with the actual piece of legislation, is everybody needs to be able to see a doctor when they're sick, right? That's actually the fundamental value proposition, is that we all get to see a doctor when we're sick. And we know that we won't lose the home when we do that. That there's a way for us to actually be fully participative in society because our basic human needs are taken care of, right? So that's actually the debate that across ideological spectrum call us to a more democratic practice. And if you think about that, and that in and of itself is a form of important transformation that I think no matter our ultimate, calculation of what our particular dollars do, we know we need to contribute because at the end of the day, much of philanthropy is trying to ensure that people are taken care of, that people are able to participate, that the nation is prospering, our needs are getting met, and we're all able to participate in being part of the solutions to the problems we all collectively face, right? So what happens in philanthropy, and I'm going to give you one other healthcare example, because as this debate was, we were doing some work in Mississippi with community-based groups on health equity, particularly focused on communities of color and rural white communities in the South. And we were actually showing them how we're communicating on health. And on the one hand, you had the advocates on the side of health reform saying, 563,000 Mississippians stand to benefit from healthcare exchanges. And you had, on the other side, we have to protect our Second Amendment rights to carry guns. And I mean, it had nothing to do with healthcare is my point. Because the value proposition was a liberty frame. It was a liberty value, and it was a debate for that group of folk that said, we think this is a fundamental encroachment on an important value for us, which is our liberty. Now, personally, I disagree with that, but part of it was we weren't saying, but what the national debate we want to have is whether we're all going to get to see a doctor, because that's actually a much more collective problem-solving frame. And it wasn't, by and large, the frame that was a funded frame. And that's not because philanthropy, that's not a blame on philanthropy. So I think part of the thing we have to understand is there are all sides of this. So grant seekers often will tell Gara what we think Gara wants to hear in order to get the grant. And then part of the danger of this kind of metrics, a narrow metrics approach, because I actually believe in having some metrics, but the narrow transactional approach is we need to be able to report back and show that we did what we said we were going to do. So that what happens is even on our side, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're actually trying to produce a much larger transformational set of metrics. And that once we call that transformational, then we have to actually evaluate what we're doing differently. And what I mean by that is it can't be linear. It can't be. So the example I'll give, which was as a grant seeker, is I had one funder ask us, we were doing work in the context of broadband and making sure communities that are excluded from broadband are actually able to engage in the policy debate and get access to high-speed internet, right? And for us, fundamentally, for us, part of the transformational metric was this is a racial justice issue. That it's not just about the economy, it's about whether we're all able to participate, because in the 21st century, you can't participate economically, you can't participate in social or political life. There's a whole level of participation that does not exist for you if you don't have high-speed internet access. And that for us, part of the transformational metric is if we as a society could be engaging in the discussion of fundamental infrastructure differently. The founder that funded us said, but what are you going to produce? And we said, well, we had obviously a lot of specific things we were going to try to produce. That was part of a much, much larger, longer-term strategy. That was not short-term. That was not linear. That we're going to have components we couldn't fully identify. We could identify for 2 years out, but that we're going to require, in terms of real success, a whole set of strategies and metrics that we're going to extend beyond that 2 years. And in the end, the grant maker insisted that we said exactly how much money we were going to get moved to communities of color for broadband. And that at the end of that grant cycle, and we actually did have some strategies we had to try to get some pilot programs funded and supported in rural communities of color. But that at the end of the day, we lost on that, right? That pilot did not get funded out of BTOP funds. And so then the metric for the foundation is we failed, right? Because we didn't get $15 million for BTOP funds. And that what it ignores is that we actually have a significant number of people actually engaging in the development of new kinds of pilots to contest about how we spend public resources and whether we meet the needs of rural communities, and actually what it means to build additional opportunities out of infrastructure investments, right? But we didn't have a ready set of metrics that foundations could understand connected to that connected it to a value of social inclusion, of we all have to be able to participate in the society. So I just want to make one other point about that, because Gara, one of the things about Gara, as many of you know, is that he's deeply, deeply committed to inclusion, and part of that includes racial justice as well as LGBT inclusion, as well as gender, as well as a range of other issues. And that if we actually look at one of the things that philanthropy is not doing in turning this kind of sense of what are our goals, what's our evaluation, what are we actually trying to do back on itself, is actually thinking about some of what it means from a philanthropic perspective to be more inclusive. And what I don't mean in the foundation, I'm not talking about diversity. I'm talking about in terms of what we are supporting in terms of inclusion of people outside of the foundation. And the reason I raise that is because a lot of the metrics and the way foundations are now structuring their strategies means that communities of color cannot compete for the dollars. So while we're at a point in time now where literally half of all children being born are either Latino or Black or Asian or Native American, community of color investment from philanthropy has shrunk dramatically in the past decade. And that therefore the investments in the infrastructure, right, the social infrastructure for participation is not amongst our evaluations of our value proposition. And we have to change that.
Hi, thanks. Add my thanks to Bill for having me here. And I would say that I agreed with more of what Gara said just now than I did when I read his talk, and I think, but I did disagree with some of what was in his talk. Let me first, though, start with what I liked about it, and I think there's a lot in that talk to be admired. So, for example, I agree with him that today our political discourse is too often focused on what's pragmatically possible, poll-driven pragmatism at the expense of moral clarity and moral courage. And I think whether the examples climate change or healthcare or immigration, all examples that Gara cites, we don't hear enough about what simply is right. I think you could also make the point that at this very moment in Washington, a little more focus on what is pragmatically possible might be helpful. But where I part company with Gara is when he asserts that this problem has infected philanthropy, or when he suggests that there's some disconnect in philanthropy between the moral case for what we do and the quest to understand what works. Or when he seems to imply that the fact that too many foundations are entrenched in fixed and safe positions, and I would agree, is attributable to a focus on effectiveness, when I would argue the opposite is the case. So Gara says in his talk, in marching under the flag of what works, and in particular what can be proven or demonstrated through the rigors of evidence, we risk straying too far from what is right. And I guess I would say we stray from what is right when we do not assess. This is, after all, about the people we seek to help. And if we don't do the necessary work to confirm that we are, in fact, helping, then we're falling short of our moral obligation. Mario Marino, who many of you know because he's, I think, based in Washington, or Venture Philanthropy Partners is, argues in his really good new book, Leap of Reason, every ounce of our effort on assessing social outcomes should be with one end in mind: helping nonprofits deliver greater benefit to those they serve. In my view, it's nothing less than a moral outrage when programs like DARE or Scared Straight receive massive funding only to realize that they're having the opposite, much too late, the opposite of the intended effect or no effect. And Mario's book has another powerful example from right here in Washington of such an instance. The Latin American Youth Center, which was seeking to educate young men about domestic violence, and realized that its programming was having the opposite of the intended effect on attitudes. They realized it because they had the assessment mechanisms in place to know it, and then they retooled their program in order to achieve the results they wanted to achieve. Or consider another example, the durable programmatic infestation of abstinence-only education in the face of clear evidence that it fails to protect young people from unintended pregnancy or sexually transmitted disease. We're painfully aware, all of us, that our resources are finite, limited. That means that ineffective or counterproductive strategies deflect attention and waste time and money urgently needed to support and expand strategies that are effective. Gara says in his MIT talk, the effectiveness movement is now finding, I believe, that there is no real constituency for effectiveness as such because it is values that move people. So I say, well, whatever happened to doing what's right because it's right, rather than worrying about whether there's a constituency for it, which I think is sort of how you open your MIT talk in terms of the political discourse. I would say it's morally right to learn as much as possible about whether what you're doing is having the desired effect, whether it's politically popular or not. And let's take on the challenge of building the constituency for effectiveness. My experience at the Center for Effective Philanthropy suggests that there is one, and I think it's growing. A survey we conducted of CEOs earlier this year shows that the overwhelming majority of foundation CEOs, large foundations, say assessment is one of their highest priorities. The constituency for effectiveness has deep roots, too. I mean, we didn't create it. We're working on it. Kathleen and Gio are working on it, but it's not new. Bill Schambra often reminds us, although to him it is a lament, that the mania to measure goes back to the early days of Rockefeller and Carnegie. The constituency for effectiveness is made up of all those who are not content to assume that they're doing as well as they could be doing, those who are not content to take for granted that they might not be unintentionally doing harm when they think they're doing good, those who want to learn and improve, those who reject ignorance and seek knowledge, those among the foundations who want to break out of the bubble of isolation and positive feedback that affiliation with a large endowment tends to create, so that they can learn how they're really doing, how they're really perceived. And it's a growing constituency of those who believe that effectiveness is a moral imperative. So my big point here is there's no tension between assessment, effectiveness, and morality. There never has been. We're morally obliged to know how we're doing so we can improve. And I would argue that the impulse to understand effectiveness stems exactly from our reasons for doing the work in the first place. So if we really care about improving the lives of former foster kids, we must track then, as the Stewart Foundation does in California and its grantees, the number of those kids aging out of the foster care system with a lifelong connection to a caring adult, and the number that go on to graduate from college. If we really care about civil rights for gays and lesbians, as the Gill Foundation and its grantees do, then we must track carefully in which states gays and lesbians enjoy the same legal protections, whether in marriage or in the workplace, as heterosexuals. If we really care, as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and its grantees do, about tackling the obesity epidemic, then we must track the relevant data, including the data on the aspects of our strategy that they've chosen to attack that issue, just as the foundation did so well in its successful work to bring down the rate of tobacco use in the United States. Some of these foundations, just full disclosure, provide grant funding to CEP. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation does. But so does Atlantic, and you can see that that isn't stopping me.
Because I'm not
But
the
Garrett's
CEO
going.
anymore.
Did I know that?
remember you
did I know that at the time I accepted the invitation? I don't know. If we really care, as the Wilberforce Foundation and its grantees do, about the preservation of habitats for wildlife, then we must be data-driven in the tracking of endangered species and seek to strengthen the organizations on the ground in local communities doing that work, as Wilberforce does. And then Wilberforce goes out and, with help from us, seeks to find out, do the grantees they seek to strengthen actually think the foundation has been helpful to them in the ways that Wilberforce hopes. These organizations assess because they bring passion to important issues. Caring and knowledge of efficacy are not intention. They are not qualities to be held in balance, as Gara suggests. They form instead a virtuous cycle. Just as we should reject the caricatures and polarization that we see too much of in our political world and that cheapen our political discourse, so too should we reject them in philanthropy. I'd argue that invocation of morality without any regard to effectiveness is often just ideology. We work in the nonprofit sector because of our desire to make communities stronger, lives better, air cleaner, whatever the goal is that you and your organization fight for. That's why we do the work. For that reason, we want to know, and most of us deeply, desperately want to know, if what we're doing is working, if it's really making a difference. Of course, it's hard to know. Some of the attempts to answer those questions are misguided or ill-designed, and I'm not here to defend stupid measurement. I'd be the first to acknowledge that some assessment is done badly, and I'd also concede that some make the foolish choice to let ease of measurement drive their selection of goals in the first place. But let's not let those errors in thinking and approach taint our view of the importance of assessment. The fact is that the alternative to measurement and assessment is flying blind, doing nothing, or worse than nothing when we mean to be doing good, failing to know what really helps people, failing to direct resources in ways that really result in improvement in people's lives, failing to be our very best. So assessment and morality aren't in tension, never have been. On the contrary, we're morally obliged to know how we're doing so we can learn and improve. Thank you.
Thank you all, and as always, it's great to be back here at Hudson. I hope all of you are aware that this year Hudson is celebrating its 50th anniversary. That's a long time in the life of a think tank, and it continues to produce work, including this program, well, maybe not including this program, but a lot of work that remains at a very high quality.
But have they assessed it?
I don't know. I know there is a pragmatic test, but I think those of us who've been CEOs of organization know that one of the measures of success is what we call the bottom line, notwithstanding difference between nonprofits and businesses. Well, I think as anyone has known Gara LaMarche's very distinguished career, read his speech, or heard his remarks today, would acknowledge he is a man renowned for his benevolence. He truly wants philanthropy to reclaim its moral authority, which to him means embrace what he refers to as progressive worldviews, and lessen the fixation of philanthropy on what he calls policies, programs, and bills. As I read this, for some reason, I kept thinking about a famous dialogue that many school children would have known if they had gone to school in the middle 19th century. And as a result, most is largely unknown to we more enlightened people today. And it is a dialogue from McGuffey's Readers, which normally goes under the title of True and False Philanthropy. And the protagonists are named Mr. Phantom and Mr. Goodman. I'll give you a guess who's the more sympathetic one. I just want to read a brief excerpt from it. Mr. Phantom, I despise a narrow field. Oh, for the reign of universal benevolence. I want to make all mankind good and happy. Mr. Goodman, dear me, sure that must be a wholesale sort of job. Had you not better try your hand at a town or neighborhood first? Mr. Phantom, sir, I have a plan in my head for relieving the miseries of the whole world. Everything is bad as it now stands. I would alter all the laws and put an end to all the wars in the world. I would put an end to all punishments. I would not leave a single prisoner on the face of the globe. This is what I call doing things on a grand scale. Skipping over some, resumes, Mr. Goodman, well now, I have a notion that it is as well to do one's own duty as the duty of another man, and that to do good at home is as well to do good abroad. For my part, I would as well help Tom Saunders to freedom as a Pole or a South American, though I should be very glad to help them too. But one must begin to love somewhere, and I think it is as natural to love one's own family and to do good in one's neighborhood as to anybody else. And if every man in every family, village, and county did the same, why then all the schemes would be met, and the end of one village or town where I was doing good would be the beginning of another village where somebody else was doing good. So my schemes would jut into my neighbor's, his projects would unite with those of some other local reformer, and all would fit with a sort of dovetail exactness. Mr. Phantom, sir, a man of large views will be on the watch for great occasions to prove his benevolence. Mr. Goodman, yes, sir, but if they are so distant that he cannot reach them, or so vast that he cannot grasp them, he may let 1,000 little, snug, kind, good actions slip through his fingers in the meanwhile. And so, between the great things that he cannot do and the little ones that he will not do, life passes and nothing will be done. Well, Mr. Goodman's view of philanthropy is very different from Mr. Phantom's, as you could tell, and I think from Mr. LaMarche's as well. Mr. Goodman favors a pragmatic approach. Think locally, try to do what is feasible, and avoid grand schemes and moral posturing. Now, I have no doubt that Mr. LaMarche is sincere in his belief that philanthropy needs to become more moralistic. But I am not so sure that he fully appreciates the consequences of what he is proposing. One obvious issue, which he did note a bit today, is whose morality? Progressive goals are not the only set of goals. Indeed, in the text of his talk, Mr. LaMarche notes with some chagrin that in advocating a more moralistic philanthropy, he is winding up on the same side as some religious figures with whom he has disagreed in the past. But of course, there are more moral points of view than religious ones as well. Visions of the good society embodied by philanthropy, in fact, are probably too numerous to count. Temperance, war, eliminating want, ignorance, the list can go on, and there's a good reason for this. As my recently deceased and very much missed colleague Robert Payton repeatedly emphasized, philanthropy is the expression of morality. If Mr. LaMarche is suggesting that a particular vision of morality should be more authoritative in philanthropy than others, he is missing a very key point. The essence of philanthropy, especially in contrast to government, is to champion many moral viewpoints, including those that may not be widely held. A second issue gets to this question of effectiveness. What can be done? It is one thing to embrace morally laden goals, another thing to be able to achieve them. This is a familiar problem summarized in the old saying that wishing won't make it so. Even, I might add, with all the money Bill Gates has to spend behind it. There are lots of reasons for this. We don't always know how to achieve our goals, or the means themselves may be objectionable on moral or other grounds. Important as it could be, philanthropy always and inevitably has its limits, especially in a free society, which may make its accomplishments a pale imitation of its aspirations. One might even wonder if associating with the amounts of money found in some philanthropies these days may make it more difficult to be realistic about what one can reasonably accomplish. Some of you have heard the old joke about what it's like to work for a foundation. 3 things will never happen to you again. You will never eat in anything but a first-class restaurant, sleep in anything but a first-class hotel, or have anyone tell you the truth about yourself and what you are doing to your face. And that makes it very hard to keep your feet on the ground and very easy to think that what you believe to be right is something that you can obtain. There are no shortage of examples of morally driven philanthropists whose efforts fell short. One of my favorites, because it's a sad one, involves Andrew Carnegie. We all remember his work on libraries, but he actually dedicated the last portion of his life to trying to put an end to war. And he spent a great deal of money, even erected what was called then the Peace Palace in The Hague on this behalf, but all that came to naught as the result of 2 bullets fired by the tubercular son of a Serbian postman one summer day in Sarajevo. There are many others. Walter Annenberg's efforts at school reform. Mr. Gates has talked about eliminating all the deadly childhood diseases. Good luck. Nice aspiration. But again, as Mr. Goodman suggested, you may be pursuing that fruitlessly while other things that might be more doable don't get done. Mr. LaMarche does allow that he supports the effectiveness movement, as we've just heard, but perhaps he'll explain to us a little more what he means when he goes on to say, "At times it seems to me as if this movement has strayed too far from why anyone should be concerned about effectiveness at all, from passion about the deep and tenacious social inequities that move philanthropy in the first place." If anything, as Phil's just told us, taking effectiveness seriously should mean asking tough questions about which goals we can actually accomplish and which are essentially pie in the sky. The third and final issue I want to raise is who actually benefits from the kind of moralistic philanthropy that Mr. LaMarche is advocating. The answer is by no means obvious. Apart from the question of what can be accomplished, philanthropy faces the not inconsiderable challenge of aligning its goals, its moral values, however worthy they may be, with those of the people it intends to help. This, too, is an old problem. The rich are different than you and me, F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said, and so are philanthropists, or at least the kind who create or staff very large foundations. Why should we assume that what they want or think we should want is in fact what we want, let alone need? The history of philanthropy is full of examples suggesting the riskiness of such an assumption. More than a few donors have proposed solutions that, as H.L. Mencken might have said, were simple, direct, and wrong. That these may have been motivated by deeply held, deeply moral convictions about what is right is not much of an excuse. This, of course, is implicit in the McGuffey dialogue I read earlier, when Mr. Goodman chides Mr. Phantom for not doing what he could. He is not only referring to its feasibility, he is also saying that Mr. Phantom's quest to remake the world as he would want it is blinding him to the possibilities of helping others on their terms. So when Mr. LaMarche urges philanthropy to reassert its moral authority, who will benefit? The donor, whose conscience is thus salved, or those who want to help, those who want help that is not coming, or even worse, feel themselves the objects not of benevolence, but something more akin to missionary work. These issues, the issues Mr. LaMarche's very interesting talk raised, have been with American philanthropy a long time. In fact, they reflect two competing strands of thought. One goes back to John Winthrop and his ambition to create a city on a hill rooted in Christian charity, which emphasizes the moral visions that are at the heart of philanthropic activity. The Utopian Socialist, Robert Owen, was another exponent of this view around the 1820s. He created a well-known experiment in utopianism in New Harmony, Indiana, based on a variety of principles. He brought, not only he came himself, but brought with him some of the most distinguished intellectuals of the age to try to live what they believed was the morally correct life. They embarked from Cincinnati along the Ohio River on a flatboat named the Philanthropist. Many others. The other strain, though, might usefully be associated with Benjamin Franklin and focuses on the importance of developing pragmatic solutions to communal issues. And this, too, is expressed in Alexis de Tocqueville's tribute to the role Americans made of civil associations, which it's worth noting he wrote about contemporaneously with the Robert Owen experiment I just described. Mr. LaMarche believes that the pragmatists have been exerting too much influence, maybe even won out over the moralists. It's not clear to me that this is so, or I would add that it would be such a bad thing if they have. Thank you.
Told you it was going to be a good conversation. I'm going to pose a couple of questions to sort of stir things up a bit, and then we're going to go to the audience because
Already pretty stirred up.
Huh?
They're already pretty stirred up.
Yes. Well, that's good, and I want to. But let me put a question to Gara. I'm trying to figure out how the responses have really foreshadowed this question in a very nice way. And your question, are we recovering, or are we returning to some sort of moral foundation, or are we trying to establish a new one? And that's actually it has an interesting historical dimension, and that is this. As Phil suggested, the notion of effectiveness, of technologically proficient grant making, actually has embedded in it a kind of moral vision, which is that the things that work well are more or less on their face good, and furthermore, the things that work well avoid the ideological and moralistic clashes that Les was talking about, that you were talking about in terms of, healthcare for all versus the Second Amendment. I mean, when we have moralistic conversations about public policy, we tend to fly off in all directions, and we end up ideologically divided, as Phil suggested. So modern philanthropy, right, beginning with Rockefeller and Carnegie, part of the premise of what they were trying to do was, let's get away from all of these religious understandings of what charity should be, and let's turn our attention to what really works. The social sciences were being developed about the same time as the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations, and those foundations were big supporters of the social sciences. And the whole point was, we're developing tools that solve problems effectively for the first time. And it not only means that our problems are going to be solved, but it also means we're going to stop having these crazy ideological, moralistic collisions that paralyzed public policy in the past. I think we get, from the reaction today, we get some sense of what philanthropy might be like if we return to a sort of a pure collision of moral values. Now, that all, I think that's sort of the implicit question that it was posed here, and I wonder if you would care to react to that, or to anything else that's been said.
Sure. Sure. I think well, I have a lot to say, obviously, about what Phil and Les said, and I don't want to use it. You're not inviting me to rebut so much as answer your question to get the discussion going. So I'll try to get my points in various ways. I think they both. Thank you for engaging the speech so carefully. In each, of a different way, have a misreading of my basic premise. In fact, I was making a somewhat more modest point than I think I'm being criticized for. And morality or a moral grounding in one's advocacy or one's work is a little different than a moralistic approach. And I think the two things are a little bit different. So I think on the one hand, I think Phil has me, which I really don't think the plain text of the speech would support, rejecting the effectiveness movement or kind of arguing as if it was not bipolar. I guess bipolar is not a good thing, but there were polar opposites. That you have the kind of do-gooder, and then you have the people who are only bloodlessly concerned about impact and effectiveness. I don't believe that. That's not the vision of the world that I have, and I don't want to be associated with that kind of caricature. I think just as I think it's unfair. A lot of the criticism, for instance, a lot of the 60s social interventions is unfair for suggesting that it was utterly unconcerned with impact and just about, feel-good stuff. I think it's also wrong to, and I don't, in fact, reject the effectiveness movement. I do think that philanthropy in many respects has strayed a bit, and as I said earlier and illustrated a number of ways, from returning to first principles that motivate people to take action in the first place. So I reject I have a few more specific things to say about things that Phil says, but I reject the idea that it's a fair reading of my views, that I want the pendulum to swing back to some, feel-good philanthropy that nobody's concerned with. In fact, I accept your view, and we've talked a lot, so I don't think we're really that far apart, honestly. I accept the view that to care about whether the steps you're taking to try to solve a problem are working is itself a moral act and a moral obligation. I accept that. With respect to Les, I think I love the McGuffey stuff. I went to Catholic school, so all I know is the Baltimore Catechism, but which I can cite back, I suppose. But the McGuffey's, and I want to get a copy of that text because I think it captures very nicely the kind of colliding worldviews of certain kinds. It's the kind of discussion, debate that you and I have had over the years about, whether you proceed from the kind of, build it out from the local and eventually mankind is helped, or whether, you want to be acting at scale, which, to take it into a modern American context, which involve policy and advocacy, and, it's a question of whether or not, healthcare is the accumulation of a lot of little experiments, or whether it should be elevated in this society to a more fundamental right that is more uniform, if you will, throughout the country. And those really, I think the McGuffey's thing captured very, very nicely two camps in philanthropy. I don't, however, think, or at least I did not intend for the talk I gave to implicate those different worldviews so much, because the very reason that you liked it, and we have actually, may not agree with everything, and that we have different political worldviews suggests to me I was after something a bit different. So we can have the debate about impact and scale and advocacy and government's role and all that, and most of you who know me know what side of that debate I'm on, but I wasn't really trying to get at that in the talk that I gave. And in fact, I guess the final thing I would say is I kind of reject the notion that in arguing that that philanthropy should pay a little bit more attention to first principles and arguing things in terms of those first principles, I reject the idea that somehow suggests that I am not for the pluralism of philanthropy, or indeed the pluralism of different moral outlooks on the world. Yes, I'm a progressive, and everybody knows the kind of things I've been associated with. And yet, I think the more relevant passage, and then I'll shut up for a while, in the speech, is I want to make clear that I don't see this as a left-right issue. Immigration, criminal justice, the environment, none of these sort neatly into those kinds of political boxes. Indeed, some of the most striking passion and energy to be seen today on these matters, in the particular context, was imprisonment and the environment. And the reason we have any hope at all is emerging from the evangelical Christians, more comfortable traditionally in the political right, but moved to action by their belief in the power of redemption or the need to be careful stewards of God's earth. So I'm arguing my case is largely aimed at my own ideological cohort, but it is not an argument that progressive morality, whatever that is, should prevail, just that progressives ought to be arguing more in those fundamental principles. There's a lot else, but I don't know.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. And to Phil, on the sort of the other side of this, and obviously I posed that question to you, Gara, as you well know, by way of being something of a devil's advocate and trying to show. Yeah. Now to Phil, just very briefly, granted that you don't intend to be making the case for an obsession with metrics at the expense of morality, nonetheless, wouldn't you say, or would you disagree with it, that the practical consequence of the emphasis on effectiveness has been a massive outpouring of educational efforts, of conferences, of panels at conferences, at the annual conferences of foundations? Everything is designed to hone the instruments of measurement. And almost nothing is designed to improve our ability to reason morally about the questions of society. You were making the case that there is a moral obligation to be effective. Of course, that's quite true. But what it means to be effective isn't always clear, because effectiveness, obviously effectiveness for a conservative foundation is quite dramatically different from effectiveness for a progressive foundation. So don't we need to be a little more explicit about our education, our learning, our reasoning about the moral foundations of philanthropy, as Gara suggests? And at this point, I have to plug a book that the Bradley Center helped nurse along, Amy Cass's collection of readings, It's Giving Well, Doing Good, which is a collection of short stories, speeches, religious texts, and whatnot, that the purpose of which is to help people try to be more reasonable and rational about moral commitments. In other words, haven't you sucked up all the everywhere you go? There's Phil, and he's always doing these panels. He's
couple of things. First of all, I
us moral types are shut out.
Rather foolish to agree to serve on a panel where you're put up as the opponent to the notion that morality is important and needs to be reclaimed. I'm all for morality, and I also just want to point out that I think, Gara, I certainly think that I didn't in any way intend to caricature your talk, and I think that you do say in the talk that you believe that effectiveness is important, and you're clear about that. But I think I used your comments about the tension, about the notion that we risk straying too far from what is right by focusing on what works, as the sort of jumping off point to try to argue that's a false dichotomy, and to try to make that case. I think there are others who make the case even more forcefully than you that these things are in tension, and I'm trying to say no. And to your question, Bill, I spend a lot of time with large foundations and with the CEOs and boards of large foundations, and yet have, I think, far too few, even though there has been progress, far too few where they could say, this is how, as a board, we assess the CEO of this foundation. We have clarity about what we're trying to do, how we think we're trying to do it, and we've got some indicators, not perfect proof of impact, but some indicators of how it's going. So what, how will we know? What are those? Survey the board, survey the CEO. There are too few large foundations today that can answer that question in a compelling way. And that to me means that their cause, which is informed by their moral view of what they need to do, isn't being as effectively addressed as if they had those things clear.
Gotcha. Anyone else want to wade in at this point? Yes, well, Maya, please.
Well, I see Gara chomping at the bit. Well, so I think one of the things that is that we have glossed over too much in this conversation is this notion of it's not just whether we, because I think we all agree that there has to be assessment, that it's important to understand our impact, and that because that's a fundamental principle. We don't want to just do something for the sake of doing, right? None of us. But how do we interpret what we learn from the assessment? So I'm just going to pick up one example that you gave, Phil, and I'm not saying you intended this, but I just wanted to, what if we drew it out? So a Gill Foundation funding the fights for gay marriage. And after 2 years, it looks at its portfolio and says, we failed in 5 states. That would not actually necessarily answer the question of whether or not they were effective, because what it assumes is the fight could have been won in that 2-year cycle. It may not look at all of the aspects of building, this was my point about transformational, of building a long-term strategy and having assessment that is actually marking that in a way that understands long-term. Because that's part of what I hear in Gara's speech, is that we have to, is the challenge for philanthropy that's really grounded in what it is trying to do from a moral lens. It's not just going to look transactionally at what it's produced in 2 years. And just picking up on this notion of, left versus right, or conservative versus progressive foundations. I mean, I have to tell y'all, I really respect the Bradley Foundation. Because actually my assessment is that a lot of conservative foundations have done this much better. That actually part of what Gara is saying, or at least, and I'll say it sharply, is that I'm reading is they've been willing to invest in a set of strategies that they've been willing to be long-term because they're grounded in a clear sense of what they're trying to produce. And we have not done that as much in social justice.
Can I just, the quick thing that I wanted to say was, I think, I admire the work of DP a lot, and we've used them, twice now, maybe even more on the board stuff. And I know that there's a lot of things that DP does that go to the issue of effectiveness. I think, though, that it would be, when I was listening to you talk about kind of the perception survey, I think that's a very valuable tool, but does not, in my view, get that close to the actual real-world impact of it. Nothing to argue otherwise. In other words, the way your grantees think about what their opinion is of how effective you are, how you relate to them, is important if you care about customer service and all that, and that's not unimportant. But it's not necessarily the same thing about whether kids are, are learning better. You know what I mean? So a lot of this stuff is, in effect, kind of relational and perceptive. It's not unimportant, but a little bit different than the question of ultimate impact. And the second thing I want to say. Oh no, it goes back to Phil's original comment as well, which is, you're terrific, and I say a bit of this, I think, myself in the speech about absolute only and so on, that there are plenty of programs floating around. You mentioned DARE and absence only, and another one, I can't remember, DARE Straight, that persist and get funded, in the absence of evidence. Working as I have, for instance, in the criminal justice field for years, policy very often runs in the opposite direction of what we know is better. Why is that's a question that's on the table. It's worth pursuing because there is ideology behind a lot of these things that doesn't really. There's kind of a naive faith, I guess, I believe, sometimes in among some of my colleagues in philanthropy, that if only people understood the facts, if only they had the information for them, it would change. And the fact is, that's a predicate, but it's not nearly sufficient. And the reason these crappy programs persist, a lot of them, is because there's ideology, there's communications behind them. And I think right now we're at a point, we're talking about this a little bit informally over lunch, where in the world of education reform, which is a big, 800-pound gorilla of philanthropy now, but which is really where there's a lot of social engineering going on. So there's a moment in which are people going to be really rigorous about results, or are they going to spin, to protect things they have an ideological investment in, whether it's charter schools or whatever. There's a lot of mixed evidence, as you know, on charter schools, and also, frankly, there's a lot of money behind it now. That's true of all these other programs as well. People make money from abstinence only, from various anti-drug programs, and it's impossible really to engage those questions if you're not also playing the sphere of communications and all that. It's not evident. That's why I say you need an effectiveness movement, and I think you're, frankly, for somebody who's so committed to rigor, as I know you are, your discussion of constituency is a lot of wishful thinking. I mean, you're saying what a constituency might be, and what might put it together. I actually don't think it exists yet. If you really want to be rigorous about it.
And let me just pick up on Maya's question to you, which I think is really a terrific question. Isn't part of the problem, and Gara mentioned this as well, isn't part of the problem with effectiveness that it really does tend to suck up the oxygen in the air. By the time, I mean, it's
Can't breathe.
Yeah. I mean, no, I mean, it pushes you in the direction, as Maya suggested, of short-term results, clearly defined. Now you can maybe it's the crude misapplication of effectiveness, which I'll let you say in a second. But nonetheless, we're often dealing with people who are a lot of human beings are crude misapplicators of otherwise really worthwhile doctrines. That's how we are as human beings, and one of the things that we turn out to is between the board's concern with because they're businessmen and they're familiar with this notion of outcomes and effectiveness. The staff has now been trained in outcomes measurement and whatnot, so it's a language that they're familiar with. And they end up saying things like, well, just count the states where you've passed the legislation. And everything else becomes just a bunch of moral, political mumbo jumbo to me. I don't get all that. Just give me the count of the states where we've won in this period of time. And I mean, now to really sharpen her question, probably beyond the point where she's comfortable. But isn't that okay? Good.
So I mean, I think there's a great risk of the kind of thoughtless short-termism, overemphasis on a single measure. By the way, if you don't put any measures in front of a foundation board, they're going to find one, and it's going to be the administrative cost ratio. And they're just going to push on that because it's something that's quantifiable and comparative. What I'm suggesting is a thoughtful approach that says, given where we're trying to go, this is how we think we can get there. These are some things that we think we need to look at along the way. A robust set of indicators, of which, in terms of Gara's point about CEP's tools, I actually worry about an overemphasis on our grantee perception report because it has become a kind of a, industry standard that everybody does. That's a good thing, but not in the absence of thought about, well, why do your relationships with your grantees matter? In which ways? What questions are important? And what other data are we looking at? And to the Gil question, I mean, I think, that would be a shame if that was the approach. I mean, one of the we've did some interviews with with Roger McFarland, who died several years ago, who was the executive director of Gil, and he talked about their focus on hate crimes legislation. They wanted to reduce the rates of hate crimes, and they thought that pushing legislation was the answer. So legislation is passed, yes. But they continue to monitor what's going on. Well, incidents of hate crimes don't go down in the areas where the legislation was passed. So then they keep trying and trying different approaches. And when they coupled it with education of prosecutors and police about the legislation and about how to enforce it, then they saw the reduction in hate crimes that they were hoping to see, which is why it all matters. So they could have walked away and done exactly what you worry about,
And a lot of funders and nonprofits make those kind of mistakes all the time, and I'd be the last person to argue that that doesn't happen. So it's about doing it in a smart and thoughtful way. But I don't think the fact that some people don't is a reason to walk away from it, and I don't think anyone's arguing that.
Yeah, Les, did you have something?
Yeah, I just want to be quick because I know the audience is interested in asking some.
Be thinking of your question.
Yeah, and I really don't have much of a dog in this fight about how to measure effectiveness here. But what I do want to just emphasize, just pick up on the point Gara made, is the McGuffey excerpt and the thrust of my remarks is not about the issue of scaling up. Back to McGuffey, scaling up would have probably meant let's do it at a county level instead of a village level. It's really about moral pretentiousness, what you might call moral scaling up. That if you have these broad visionary goals, ending hate crimes, ending unplanned pregnancies. Maya said something interesting, making sure that anybody who's sick has access to a doctor. Okay? Those are all morally pleasing goals to many people, but they are goals that are extremely difficult, if not impossible, for philanthropy to accomplish. And by striving after those kinds of goals, Mr. Goodman argues, and I would second this, we miss the morally good, but more feasible goals that are right at our disposal. Instead of making sure that every sick person has access to health care, let's build a clinic. Instead of trying to create a program that reduces substantially unplanned pregnancies, let's do something with young people generally at risk in our community. There are lots of different ways by which our morally driven visions can also be realistic visions, rather than the kind of fairly sweeping idea that I read. I don't read into Gara's talk, but really is characteristic of a certain kind of liberal or progressive worldview. The world is a place full of problems, and we have to keep working to eliminate them. To which we conservatives would say, good luck. We will go on and do the kinds of things that might steer a little bit better this way, a little bit better that way, but leave aside the broader moral questions, the large moral questions that so fascinate progressives, those in the social justice movement.
We've got a deal. So you'll stay local and we'll handle the big stuff.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, right, exactly. Yeah. No, I was going to say that I think we have alignment. Philanthropy actually cannot solve all those big problems. It cannot solve all those big problems. That's why we need a strong government. There was a time in this country where the latter years of older people were characterized by extreme poverty. And Social Security, actually, a large-scale government program, has made that increasingly rare. I mean, you can actually affect human welfare, it turns out, by programs that are democratically funded and carried out. It's possible. What's the relationship of philanthropy to that? Well, that's an interesting question. I've been involved with philanthropies that, like Bradley and Owen, that tend to try to affect public policy. We have different perspectives on it, but I think there's a role. Philanthropy can't possibly meet that gap. It can, however, at its best, I think, try to model solutions that then government can take on. So I have a lot of faith. There's a lot of bad government programs too, but a lot of faith in that the big problems can be addressed by broader action. They can't be addressed by philanthropy alone, though. So Les and I are entirely in alignment on that.
Yes, please. Okay, questions now. These microphones are a little faint. So you need to hold them very close to your, speak directly into the mic and very close to the mic. And please give us your name and affiliation. Yes, right here in front.
Arnold Kling. I guess I blog at EconLog, and that might be the best affiliation. I think that there's an elephant that's not in the room here, and that's typically not in the room in philanthropy. We have representatives of donor organizations, we have representatives of service organizations, we have representatives of evaluators, we have no representatives of recipients. And I think that's always going to be the case. That's the essence of philanthropy. The difference between the philanthropy and the private sector is the private sector, ultimately the consumer has leverage. And in philanthropy, the consumer doesn't. And so I don't think it matters whether you're motivated by, or whether you operate on the basis of metrics or your moral intuition. You're basically ignoring the input of the recipient. That's the essence of it. And to me, the real challenge with philanthropy is how you get away from the arrogance of it, and how you get to, so like, sorry to use this example, but with No Child Left Behind, what we went from was, let's say, an intuition-based approach to federal education policy to a testing-based approach. Neither one of those, both of those assume implicitly that parents don't know what they're doing. And how can you get past that assumption that your recipients don't know what they're doing in philanthropy?
Can I
Yeah.
say something? So I wasn't entirely clear whether, at first I thought you were talking about the direct recipients of grant funding, the organizations, and then I realized, no, you're talking about the intended beneficiaries, the ultimately the people whose lives you're trying to improve. And I would say that I mentioned earlier in my comments that we surveyed CEOs of large foundations about the kinds of data that they look at to assess performance. And one of the least frequently checked boxes was surveys or focus groups of intended beneficiaries. And it was interesting because those who did say that they got that kind of feedback tended to also report anyway. Doesn't mean it's true that they had more confidence in their strategies and more of a sense that they knew they were achieving impact. You mentioned education. I think the Atlanta scandal is a great example, and of course we see this in business all the time with short-term quarterly profits or stock appreciations, when that single-minded focus on one metric and a dominant leader who is pushing that's everything, right? In Atlanta, they had principal seating at the annual meeting in the Georgia Dome based on the test scores, with those who didn't have high test scores standing in the back. What happens in that kind of culture with one metric? Cheating and scandal. And we're doing a project, it's a sort of a pilot project called Youth Truth, that's designed to bring student voice in high schools to education funders and to districts, charter management organizations, on the theory that kids in high schools actually have a legitimate perspective on their education, which shouldn't be a radical proposition, but apparently is. And so I agree that I think to be most effective, if you're trying to affect people's lives, you have to know something about their lives. Then that means you have to find out ways to hear from them.
That's absolutely true, and I think, one of the things that made a big impression on me when I was at OSI and we were funding youth created media, was watching a film that some kids had made. I don't remember where they were from, young kids of color, about truancy, and through which I learned that truancy was for them a kind of a considered reaction to what wasn't happening in the school. So you can learn a lot from that. I mean, I think that there's no perfect answer to this. Because of the phenomenon that Les was mentioning, when you're dealing with people who are dependent upon your largesse, you have to work really hard to get to hear what's on people's minds. But at least for the foundations I've worked in, where we tend to fund a lot of more organizations that have an actual base, organizing network, everything, where poor people are actually running the thing, or networks of prisoners and their families at OSI. I mean, I think a bit of an antidote to that is, instead of funding only, beltway, elite-run organizations, you fund organizations that actually have some base in the community, you're a little less, hostage to that. And I've put an emphasis, as Phil was suggesting in the youth voice, whatever it was thing, on trying to make sure that the money is going to organizations that are led by the people most affected, so they are actually in the vanguard of the change. That's, to me, what you need to do.
I just have a modest proposition which the ambitious IRS is welcome to put in its rules. When foundations or other philanthropists are doing something, they should have some skin in the game. So if you're in the business of school reform, make sure the children of people at the foundation are enrolled in those reformed schools. Or if you're doing something on health care, let's get rid of whatever health care plan a foundation has and make them subject to whatever plan you think is good for the rest of us.
Good. Okay. Other questions? Other questions? Let me go to this question right in the center. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm a graduate student at Center of Philanthropy, Indiana University. So I'm Dr. Nankowski's student here. Right now, I'm a summer associate at Council on Foundations. I think it's I'm from China. I think it's very interesting that our Chinese philanthropy talk about how do we overcome the moral superiority in doing philanthropy, and we call for more effectiveness in doing philanthropy. But in the United States today, we talk about reclaiming moral life of philanthropy. So it's a very good balance. My question is, I agree with that assessment itself should be morally obliged. However, I think there's still a tension between assessment and morality. For example, who does assessment? What criteria do you use? Who is participating? And how can the professional, so-called professional standard assessments to measure a diversity of missions, of organization missions? So that's my question. Thank you.
I think it's a crucial question. Who's doing the assessment, and what values are they bringing to the table, and who's involved in design? I mean, one of the big problems, I think, and Mario writes about this in his book, which I mentioned, is that when funders drive their assessment priorities without regard for the fact that those of us who run organizations that are funded by foundations have multiple funding relationships we're dealing with, and there isn't enough emphasis on if your goals, and this isn't always true, but if your goals as a foundation align well with this nonprofit's goals, why not focus your assessment on whatever's going to be most useful to them, and look at how to make them stronger as an organization, which is a big part of what GEO is focused on. And instead, what happens is the desire to satisfy the foundation board sometimes gets trickled down to grantees in ways in which they have 37 different requests for different kinds of data, none of which are actually that helpful to them in managing the organization. So I think these are all really important points. I also think that there is we need to be mindful of the fact that some assessment has been done in ways, and this is true. This is true if you think about other areas outside the nonprofit sector too. Sometimes the desire to find out what's effective and what's not is played out in ways that are immoral, and we got to make sure we don't do that.
Can I just, because this is more of a resource, philanthropic initiative for racial equity, Lori Villarosa is in the room, put together actually a publication on how to measure racial justice impact. And there's a webinar next week on Thursday at 2 o'clock that anyone's welcome to join. I will be on it amongst other authors. But one of the things we haven't actually talked about, which actually makes the connection that you're also trying to make between the moral values and evaluation assessment is actually how we assess what we're going to do. So there's a preliminary assessment we haven't even talked about, but if it's morally grounded, I mean, this goes to supporting some of what Gara was saying. If it's grounded in what we're trying to produce morally, it actually changes also what assessment evaluation will follow.
Yeah. And a lot of hands up. Just three quick things. One is, one of the dirty little secrets in philanthropy, and even in the foundations that many foundations that seem to take assessment seriously, is the lack of actual engagement with the data within the foundation. You must occasionally come across that.
Yeah. And also, I
Yeah.
would just add lack of openness with others who might.
Well,
who might
true enough.
stand to learn.
No, that's absolutely
Yeah.
that. But the second thing I was going to say is that, I think that I want to make sure that people don't read me as a critic of places like GEO and the Center for Effective Philanthropy, both of which I admire and have relationships with. I think that what they have done to a great extent, one of the most useful things they've done is actually to answer a lot of these questions about being smarter about how you assess things. And so when I got to Atlantic, I found that they had a series of what I would consider to be rather crude measures for impact. That they would, they wanted to pass an immigration bill by such and such a date, or they wanted to abolish the death penalty in so many states. And you can, over time, it led us to be somewhat less focused on a certain kind of metrics, because I lived through the 1986 immigration reform, which needed to be reformed itself later. No problem ever stays solved, forever. And it's led us actually in a way that, although we fund very different kinds of organizations than some of the conservative foundations, it had led Atlantic, and I think OSI also, to take a broader view of supporting the capacity of organizations that would be strong enough over time to deal with the issues that came up, because you can't anticipate what 10 years or 5 years from now. Now that's another whole set of metrics and measurement questions. But.
Yes, please. Yes, Curtis.
I'm sorry. Curtis Gans, Center for the Study of the American Electorate. I have a question for Phil particularly, which is metrics when you're dealing with public policy advocacy. Metrics tends to want to have results within a short framework. I had a lot to do with the motor voter bill. That took 10 years. And it took 10 years to essentially do three things. One, convince Republicans that expansion of the electorate would not necessarily hurt them. The second was to convince Democrats that having clean registration lists was not going to block people from voting. And the third was, that this was incremental change. But it took 10 years. Now, I don't know of metrics that is being used, in a way that will allow you to have results 10 years from now.
Sure. I mean, I think it's obviously hard, and I think what you're looking for are indicators that you're making progress. So you had a logic that you had to do a couple of things. You had to, one of which was convince Republicans of one thing and convince Democrats of another. I would imagine that there were various ways in which you gauged whether you were doing that, whether you were on that path. And then, of course, there was a kind of a hypothesis there that if you did that, then it would happen. That hypothesis ultimately got tested, and it proved apparently to be correct. I believe that sometimes it's as simple as trying to gauge whether you're influencing people's perspectives in the ways that you want to, because you have a logic that if you do, then other things will happen further down the road. And the fact is, you won't know whether that logic is right until some point in time where you'll either see that it was or that it wasn't. So the approach to assessment is so dependent on what the particular goal is. And when it's a policy goal, I would concede that it is harder, but I think it's possible, and that you have to do it. Otherwise you really have no information coming back about whether you're making any progress.
Great, we're down to one last question. Yes.
My name is Silvana Straw, and I'm with the Community Foundation for the National Capital Region. And I am really curious what the accountability system looks like for private philanthropy. Who are the watchdogs of foundations, and not just watchdogs for the sake of watchdogs, but watchdogs on behalf of the grantee and the consumer? So triple header.
Who's the consumer?
This gentleman here was saying that the recipient of services, so to speak, right? So the beneficiary.
Yeah.
I remember Paulo Eisenberg was my neighbor 23 years ago, next door to the foundation, and at the Center for Community Change. And other than Pablo, I don't know who's out there.
Well,
the birthday boy is after
Okay.
the national, with which Pablo had something to do, the National Center for Responsive Philanthropy.
Right.
But, please.
Well, where do you want to begin? I mean, I would make the argument that if anything, there are far too many watchdogs over philanthropy at the moment. They include, to start with, the donors and the trustees, not all of whom, are in the business of being defending whatever it is they do. They will include the grantees. Suppose you gave a grant and it was rejected, or you wanted to give a grant. You don't have to take the money, They can include any number of public officials, including not only the IRS, but attorneys general, any number of groups ranging not only NCRP, but the Center for Effective Philanthropy in its own way that can publish material that will be directly or implicitly critical. If anything, and then of course you get this fetish for transparency, in which we are now putting up 990s and other things on the web for everybody to see, as if that will really provide useful, but it's there, and some people say this is great, we need more of it, blah, so on. You have newspapers and reporters. Probably the most effective watchdog for philanthropy over the last 10 or 15 years are newspaper reporters who have done any number of exposés, and like all good journalism, they probably exaggerate the general for the specific, but nonetheless, they're out there. So I don't know where you want to start. I mean, as I'd say we have too many, you make that argument, because the underlying philosophy of philanthropy, as my Chinese student has heard, was formulated by Chairman Mao most effectively: let 1,000 flowers bloom. We have philanthropy because we want a lot of different approaches to serving the public interest. And to the extent we are headed down a path, which I fear we are, toward limiting the scope of philanthropic creativity, we are basically undermining the reason we have philanthropy.
Okay, last comments from our three other panelists. Bill, Maya?
I would just say very quickly on this point. I mean, I think private foundations, in fact, enjoy a level of freedom that other actors in our society can't. That means that they can take on and address issues that other actors in our society can't or won't. To give you a lot of examples of where that happened, and I think many of which we could agree, even with the diverse ideological perspectives, were good. But the virtue, just like human qualities, the virtue is often the vice, and that means that foundations are also free to be ineffectual. And that's the choice that we've made. I personally am comfortable with it. Because I think there are real benefits that outweigh the cost, but that's where we are.
Maya, and then Gara.
Our problems are not intractable, and I really say that because I think the thing that most struck me about our conversation today was Les's point that suggested that we couldn't all see a doctor. I actually think our problems are not intractable. I think the issue, and philanthropy is not the full solution, that both those things are true. And that philanthropy, as is true for all of us as individual citizens, as is true for other members of society, as is true for private companies, we all have a role to play in calling each other to our better angels, and philanthropy should recognize that as well.
On the scrutiny and oversight point, it's true we have a proliferation of organizations. I think that and while NCRP, which I'll put another plug in for, is that NCRP has grantee organizations on it and social movements on it who are trying to hold philanthropy accountable to a certain set of values. I think what's missing in the picture, the oversight picture, is greater attention actually to the impact of foundations in their social interventions. So very little newspaper reporting, for instance, focuses on that. Beginning to a little bit in the case of Gates and so on, which is so big it attracts that kind of journalism, and I think that's good. Finally, since I have the last word, again, thank you for providing this forum. I managed, by not answering various questions, to get most of my points in by the end of the day. I'm glad that it was such a hot day that everybody decided that an air-conditioned panel would be a good way to spend lunch. And as I proceed to kind of develop these themes, what Les and Maya and Phil had to say has been very useful to me. So thank you.
Great. Let's give our panelists a round of Yeah, yeah.